All right, everybody. Welcome to this discussion, part one of this discussion on the bloodline of Moses. I'm talking about this now because even though we're going to get back into the royal bloodline stuff in a little bit, I wanted to toss this in there because this is another very important aspect of this whole story. As many of you know, if you've been listening regularly to this channel, I have come to the conclusion, the inescapable conclusion, that there have been three factions within Judaism in the last, 7-8 centuries at least, that have been vying for power. Those three factions have always existed, but, at one time or other, one of them was more dominant than the other, while the other two were in the background. Then another one would come forward and become more dominant. During the Dark Ages, the two dominant forces were the royal and the priestly bloodline, right? The church and the state sharing power, although the church actually had more authority over the state, but they were the two dominant powers. And the third faction, the secret societies, took a back seat. They were way in the background. So the hierarchical setup was, the church or the royal, the priestly bloodline. Then came the royal bloodline, the kings, the emperors. Then, way in the background were the secret societies. They were tolerated by the church and the state, as long as they didn't, seem to be posing a threat, as long as they were cooperating with the church and state authorities. Sure, why not? They helped us with the crusades and whatnot, so they're our buddies, just stay in line. But when it was seen that they weren't staying in line anymore, and they were actually gaining a lot of financial clout, and with that, a lot of power and influence, that's when they worked together, the church and the state, to crush them out. But they didn't crush them out. That just drove them further underground. And they came back with a vengeance, the Protestant Reformation to break up the power of Rome. And then later on, revolutions to take down the kings and the emperors. It worked. Anyway, all right. So with that having been said, I hate to be redundant, but, just to keep reinforcing this important understanding of history, because it helps to put everything together and make sense of what otherwise doesn't seem to make much sense. And so, yeah, you had the Protestant Reformation, right? And to counteract that, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation was orchestrated by the secret societies. And so the Catholic Church, to counteract that now, had to come up with its own secret society, the Jesuits, and then it formulated other ones later. It's very interesting to see how it all played out. But when I talk about the priestly bloodline, I have often said, from the Aaronic line, from Aaron, because Aaron was the high priest, the original first high priest from the time of Moses onward. However, there is an interesting theory that the priestly line may actually have traced back to Moses himself. And so I want to present that evidence. It could be that within the priestly line, there are those who, technically, if you trace back to Moses, you trace back to Aaron and vice versa, because they were brothers, right? But there seems to be a desire on the part of some to more want to identify with Moses instead of Aaron. Aaron was the high priest, but Moses did serve a priestly function as well. And according to this theory, Moses was actually supposed to be the more dominant one. Some would argue, what does it matter? These characters didn't exist. Well, they did, in a sense. As I've mentioned before, and I haven't presented the evidence of that yet. I've touched on it, but I haven't really gone into it in detail. We're going to do that down the line. We're going to look at who the real Moses actually was from history, or who the Moses character was based around. Pharaoh Akhenaten. The evidence of that is absolutely undeniable. Just like it's undeniable that the so-called Egyptian slavery in Egypt was actually a corruption of the real story of the Hyksos occupation of Egypt, where they were enslaving the Egyptians and not vice versa. But anyway, I want to present this because it's another important dimension to this whole priestly line thing. It's very interesting. And I made this discovery years ago when I read a book called The Secret Society of Moses. Very interesting book. It's an Italian author, Barbiero is his name. I forget his first name, but anyway. Oh gosh, this must have been back in 2012. It was about 10 years ago. I read it and I knew immediately, wow, I got to put some notes together on this. This thing is, it's amazing. So these notes are based around that book. I added, as always, some more material of my own to it to expand it a little. But essentially, it's based on that book. So if you want to read into this further, you might want to check that book out. Anyway, when we read the Bible account of the life of Moses, there's one very striking fact that leaps out at us, or at least should leap out at us. It's not so much what the Bible says about Moses, but what it doesn't say about Moses. When we come to the account of Moses' death, for example, this is all that we are told, and this is from Deuteronomy 34, 1-6. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, and the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. Looking out at the whole land of Canaan, or, the promised land, the whole 9 yards. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land that I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to you, to your descendants. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross over into it." This is because, Yahweh was mad at Moses. He was punishing him for losing his temper. Something Yahweh is known for, isn't it? But anyway, he was punishing Moses, and he said, I'm not going to allow you to enter the promised land. I'll let you see it, but you're not going to be able to enter it. So here he is showing him the promised land. This is what I promised, to Abraham. And this is what the children of Israel that you have been leading out of Egypt, this is what they're going to inherit. In the real world, this story was Akhenaten being kicked out of Egypt, and according to Egyptian records, the Hyksos was sent back from whence they came to Shalem. And we find out from, Manetho, for example, that this band of exiles crossed into the Sinai. Isn't that interesting? So Akhenaten led his buddies of refugees through the Sinai en route back to Shalem. Shalem, again, is the ancient name for Jerusalem. Tell me that's not the biblical story of the Exodus. But anyway, the passage goes on. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab. We're supposed to believe that, quote, the Lord here buried Moses. He must have materialized in human form so he could pick up the shovel, or maybe he just used a magic trick and made the shovel dig on its own. But Yahweh buried Moses, we're told. Freaking ridiculous. Anyway, this is how the story goes. He buried him there in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. That's very strange, wouldn't you say? Why is the Bible so silent on this? Don't you find it just a little bit strange that nothing more is said about the death of this individual who is probably the most important figure in the entire history of all Judaism, right? The one through whom the law was given, the Torah, the basis of all of Judaic belief, right? The Zohar, the Kabbalah, the Talmud, all of these things, even the New Testament, right? All of it grew out of the Torah. The original Bible was the Torah. Even the rest of the Old Testament all stemmed from the Torah. It is the foundation of everything that followed, right? And Moses allegedly wrote it, or at least it's the story of Moses. And Moses / Akhenaten. And I'll argue, folks, this is why Masonry traces its origins back to Egypt. Oh, it goes back to Egypt, all right. Hyksos Egypt. I talked earlier on this channel about Masonry through the ages. I think that's what it was called. Masonry through the ages. Go back and listen to that, and I talk about, the history of Masonry going back to ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians did have a secret society and esoteric beliefs, blah, blah, blah. They were of a Judaic or a Hebraic nature. I call the Hyksos the Proto-Hebrews. They weren't really known as Hebrews at the time. Later, they became known as that. But in their earliest form, they were the Hyksos. And because they occupied Egypt, that's why Masonry is clearly Judaic. Nobody can deny that. Jews don't even deny it. Many prominent Jews have admitted and boasted. There's no question. The whole thing is built around the Temple of Solomon, just like the Knights Templar, right? That's where the name came from. Knights of the Temple. What temple? Solomon's Temple. Remember all the time they spent in Jerusalem? That's why they fought in the Crusades, to take back Jerusalem from the Muslims and to specifically go down there to dig. They anticipated they probably wouldn't be able to hold control of Jerusalem for very long because the Muslim world had them greatly outnumbered in that area. And in fact, they did take it back. So they were hoping they could keep it. But in the meantime, while they did have control, their most important priority was to engage in digs down there. They were looking for something. They were looking for a lot of hidden treasure and perhaps some other items. We'll get into that in a future video. But these secret societies were all based, they were Judaic, all based around Solomon's Temple and tracing their roots back to ancient Egypt, Hyksosian Egypt. And so I'll argue that in this particular presentation, the argument is that the priestly bloodline traced its roots back to Moses, i.e. to Akhenaten. Here's a little something I want to throw in there right now. And again, we'll get into this in detail later. But it's very interesting to note that Christ in the book of Revelation, and I've mentioned this before, but we're going to break this down in more detail later. Christ is called the Amen in the book of Revelation, right? He's literally called the Amen or the Amen. In that context, the word Amen has nothing to do with the affirmation at the end of a prayer, right? He's called the Amen. The Amen is, of course, an ancient Egyptian god, one of several sun gods that they had, right? They had Aten, they had Amen, they had Ra, all of them sun deities, solar gods. But Christ is called the Aten. The Amen. Not the Aten, but the Amen. Whereas Akhenaten, of course, worshipped the Aten or the Adon, the Adonai. You could argue two different names for the same God, But Christ wasn't called the Aten. He was called the Amen, right? The anti-Atenists in Egypt were opposed to Akhenaten not because he worshipped the Aten deity. Aten was a part of the Egyptian pantheon. But they were opposed to the fact that he was imposing upon them the sole worship of the Aten, the sun deity, right? They wanted all their other gods included. He excluded them and called it heresy and smashed all the temple idols, just what you would expect from a proto-Hebrew, right? They wanted only their God worshipped. All the other gods are evil. Only our God is the real God. That's exactly what Moses was all about, and that's exactly what Akhenaten was all about, who was the real Mosaic figure. Anyway. So the line of Akhenaten, or the line of Moses, would have been followers of Aten. But yet Christ isn't called the Aten. He's called the Amen. Why? Because he was of the royal bloodline. And so he wasn't an Atenist. But the form of Christianity that wound up dominating after Rome fell, and I'll argue Rome fell because of the workings of the Judeo-Christians who were carrying on the insurrectionist movement of the first century from behind the scenes, clandestinely, that's the group that wound up winning. They were sun worshippers, but worshippers of the Aten. And that's why in the Catholic Church, to this day, you will see all kinds of solar imagery, right? The halos over Jesus's head, the sun god, even behind Mary's head, or the bright radiating sunbeams of the monstrance that they put the little magic wafer in, for the mass, the little Jesus cookie, that round-shaped Jesus cookie that has IHS on it, which they'll argue, oh, well, that's Jesus abbreviated in Greek. Iesus, right? Yeah, the first letters of Jesus in Greek is IHS, or Iota, Eta, Sigma. However, those are also the three letters of the Egyptian Trinity, Isis, Horus, and Seb. And the ancient Egyptians had those equivalent letters on their little magic round wafers that they used in their original ceremonies, eating of bread and drinking of wine. It's all plagiarism, right? The whole Christian mythos, it all was plagiarized, as I pointed out before. Anyway, this is kind of a long diversion, but it's very, 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 very interesting that Christ isn't called the Aten because he was of the royal line. He didn't accept the Mosaic / Akhenaten heresy of the Adonai cult, right? But we'll get into that more later. But do you see how profound, guys, their influence has been? Do you see how they foisted upon us through Christianity, through Catholicism and Protestantism? They have had such a profound and toxic influence on our society. Christians want to argue that, if it wasn't for Christianity, we wouldn't be here today. Christianity has offered so much. Not true. Good things have come about through some segments of Christianity, yes. To this day, there are a lot of good-hearted people within Christianity that do a lot of good deeds, that helping local communities, with soup kitchens and giving out clothing, the goodwill, what is it, the Salvation Army, no doubt. But I don't attribute that to Christianity, even though it's done under the banner of Christianity. It's individual people with a good heart that are doing that. Guess what? Freemasonry does the same thing. At the highest levels, Freemasonry is doing it to make themselves look good while they're engaged in corrupt activities. But I'll argue the same thing is going on within Christianity. When it's big-name churches doing this, they're doing it for the same reason Freemasonry is, just to give themselves, good PR for the public so they look good. And yet there are a bunch of scoundrels at the top living high off the hog, sucking off of people, manipulating them, selling them a lie they don't even believe themselves. Yet the lower level participants in those good deeds in the Christian world are actually decent people for the most part. And so it is in Freemasonry. There's a lot of decent Freemasons who donate to causes that are done, to help people. And they do it out of a good heart, right? The low-level Freemasons, they don't know better. They actually do want to help people. They don't realize that the agency that they're associated with, most Freemasons don't. They keep them in ignorance. There are many quotes over the years from, people like Manly P. Hall, Albert Pike, where they boasted that, Freemasonry is a secret society within a secret society, and that most of Freemasons are deliberately kept in ignorance of the real meaning of the symbols of Freemasonry. It's not until you reach the higher degrees. Most Freemasons never go past the 3rd degree. They don't know what Freemasonry is really all about. To them, it's just a social club and will forever remain that because they're found not to be worthy to climb the ladder, i.e., they're not lacking in a conscience so they can be trusted with the inner secrets of the order. But they're useful idiots, so we'll keep them on board. They can continue to contribute. They can continue to be used to advance our agenda without them even knowing it, right? Without them knowing what they're supporting. And their sincerity will give us a good name, a good look. And so it is within, corporate Christianity. It's the same thing, guys. They love the sincere ones that do good deeds, makes them look good. It legitimizes them as a religion, a godly religion, when they're nothing of the sort at the high levels. Anyway, really got off on a tangent there, and I forgot exactly what my point was supposed to be, but oh, guys, it's a massive octopus with far more than just 8 legs. This thing branches out in so many directions. There's so many aspects and angles to it. But we can make sense of it as we begin to break it down, as we begin to look at its earliest roots when this ugly tree first began to grow and spread out its tentacles everywhere. We can put the pieces together and see how this is all played out. Anyway, as I was saying, Moses obviously is a very highly important figure, not just within Judaism, within Islam, within Christianity. Just look what else was said about Moses just a few verses later in this same chapter, Deuteronomy 34, now reading verses 10 through 12. Since then, the death of Moses after the Lord buried him, right? Since then, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all these signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land, for no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. No one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. You might say, well, wait a minute, if Moses was supposed to be the Pharaoh, what's he doing going back to Egypt to talk to the Pharaoh? Well, we'll get into that later. In any case, for now, just suffice it to say that, Moses was, as the Bible declares, the most significant person in Judaic history. There's never been another one like him who performed such awesome deeds and portrayed such mighty power. Moses is the key figure in Judaism, right? He got the whole ball rolling. He's the one who supposedly, started the authoring of the Bible. There were no sacred Hebrew texts prior to Moses. It all started with him. So it would make sense that the priestly bloodline would want to trace its roots back to him, even more so than to Aaron. Aaron takes a back seat, even though he's portrayed as the high priest, right? Maybe he was a diversion away from Moses because maybe they were afraid that if people started connecting who the real Moses was, going back to Egypt, they'd realize, oh, wow, this whole religion is just based on the Hyksos rebellion. Hyksos, well, it was a rebellion of sorts, but the Hyksosian overthrow of Egypt, and that these are the same guys down to the centuries that have done the same thing in so many other countries everywhere they've gone. They've hijacked governments, infiltrated them, enslaved them with their banking enterprise. They've always wanted to remain unknown, in the background, the quiet, subtle manipulators. Just like Woodrow Wilson said, right? There's a power in Washington so pervasive, so overwhelming, and yet so subtle that no one dare speak against it in condemnation of it. That's the same power. Centuries and centuries and centuries later, still doing the same thing it always had done. They don't mind if some of their figureheads do show up in public on display for all to see. That's been the case quite a bit, right? Usually they're behind the scenes, not actually directly calling the shots. They are calling the shots from behind the scenes. Someone else is implementing them for them as their little puppet. But there have been many times where they themselves have sat enthroned, right? Like the royal bloodlines, the kings and the emperors of Europe, all during the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the popes of Rome. But only when it was not known who they were. They would change their names. They would mingle in like they were part of the mainstream of society. Only then would they let their faces be seen. But their main game has been to remain behind the scenes and pull the strings. They love that clandestine operation. Just like the secret societies, right? The real powers that run the world today. It's not the kings and emperors anymore. It's not the Vatican anymore, although the Vatican still has a lot of power, but only because it has been thoroughly infiltrated and controlled by this third faction, the secret societies. The entire Vatican is completely run by the P2 Lodge, which began in 1965, during the Vatican II Council. That's when all that had taken place. Somebody sent me an email yesterday, and I've seen pictures like this before. There's quite a few of them, but it was a picture of His Not-So-Holiness with his hand inside of his cloak, the Freemasonic hidden hand sign, right? There he is telling you who he really is and who he's working for. Now, he'd be evil anyway, even if it wasn't Freemasonry controlling him. The Vatican's always been evil. It's another faction of Judaism, right? But he's telling you that I now am in league with the third faction. There's pictures of popes shaking hands, making the Masonic handshake with the thumb bent up to a point, wrapped around the person's hand. It's very unique, the Masonic handshake. It's not a normal handshake that everybody else does. So when you see that, there's no question it's a Mason. Nobody else shakes hands like that. There's other ones where they're doing the bear's paw, where it's kind of like a kung fu fist, and they put it over their heart. That's another classic indication of a Mason. You'll see a lot of popes that have done that. A lot of kings and emperors and their royal portraits were seen doing that. So you can see early on in the 18th, 19th centuries, a lot of these kings and emperors had already been infiltrated by the secret societies. They already had them under their control. When you see revolutions happening in history, it's because those particular kings weren't Masons. They couldn't get them on board, so they had to overthrow them by staging a revolution. Anyway, we see from this last passage here, Deuteronomy 34:10-12, that not only was Moses important to his religious devotees here on earth, but to God himself, right? Yet again, only a few vague verses are dedicated to his death and burial, and there's no more mention as to exactly where he was buried. Why? Every other detail of Moses' life is laid out meticulously in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Yet the author of Deuteronomy, whoever it was, would have us believe that he knew no details of Moses' death and burial. Is this even possible? What's going on with that? Bible dupes insist that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy along with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But clearly he couldn't have written Deuteronomy, or at least not this portion of Deuteronomy, because it describes his death. Moses didn't write that now, did he? Anyway, don't get me wrong. Evidence suggests that a good deal of the stories from Moses' life are simply fictitious, right? But the basic core of the story can be traced to its original source, the story of Akhenaten. But anyway, much importance is afforded this individual in the Bible for a reason. Why then is his death and burial glossed over so lightly? Why are we not told that there was, anyone present at his death? We're supposed to believe that Yahweh buried him, really? Or did somebody else bury him? Obviously, if he was buried at all, somebody had to do it. I think we can rule out the Yahweh explanation. Who was this person? What's going on here? The New Testament plays that same game, as I pointed out before. You've got Jesus at this prominent wedding in Cana, where he supposedly turned the water into wine. Yeah, he did it using a magic trick from Heron of Alexandria that he learned from reading his book there on magic tricks. But anyway, in that story, the wedding is portrayed as, a very important couple, right? Very illustrious. It was these were very prominent people of the day. They obviously had a lot of money. When you read the story, right? There was, the equivalent of 180 gallons of the finest wine. Where did they get the money for that? Never mind that Jesus magically made it appear out of thin air. Har, har, har. No, this was a very prominent couple that got married, and yet no mention is made of their names. Isn't that just a little bit troubling? Why? Why the secrecy? Shh. Just like Jesus' secrecy early on when he would heal someone, supposedly. But he would say, don't tell it to anyone. Shh. Keep it quiet between us. Why? Why the secrecy? Anyway, reading Deuteronomy 34 leads us to believe that the Lord himself buried Moses, right? Regardless how one cares to interpret that, the obvious implication is that we are to believe that no other human was present at the time and no one knows where he was buried. Was this some sort of cover-up? Did Moses, at the time of his death, pass something on to his genetic and spiritual posterity through his 2 sons, Eleazar and Gershom, and, through Joshua, to whom he handed the keys or handed the torch on, if you will, as a military leader, which he didn't want recorded? Certainly seems that way, doesn't it? Such silence about the deaths of other patriarchs and prophets is not found in the Bible. We're told that Abraham, for example, was buried by his sons Isaac and Ishmael in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron. Isaac was buried by his sons Esau and Jacob. Jacob's funeral was of a particularly elaborate nature, having the whole second half of the last chapter of Genesis being dedicated to it. We're told there that his corpse was embalmed in Egypt and then transported to Hebron. Even the death of Aaron, Moses' brother, was recorded in detail, mentioning when and by whom he was buried in Numbers chapter 20, verse 29. But it gets even stranger still. Another thing that the Bible fails to mention about Moses is his descendancy. For example, in the last 3 books of the Pentateuch, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, his family isn't mentioned at all. They disappear into obscurity. The last mention of his family is found in Exodus 18. Not only that, but in all of the begat chapters of the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, absolutely none of them traces any lineage from Moses. Why is that? The most important figure, right? We just read where no one since has performed such great deeds, such mighty works as Moses. And yet nobody traces their lineage back to him. Neither do any of the genealogies in the New Testament trace lineage from Moses, right? Christ's lineage is given in Matthew and in Luke. They don't harmonize with each other, by the way, expectedly. But nevertheless, they don't mention Moses at all. Yet Christ had a very profound respect for Moses, didn't he? He mentioned Moses all the time. If they believe not Moses and the prophets, blah, 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 neither will they believe, if one rises from the dead. In other words, it's more important to read the writings of Moses than to witness someone rising from the dead. That's a greater testament of truth. A greater convincing piece of evidence of Yahweh and his teachings, to read Moses. Christ also said, don't do as the Pharisees do. They're hypocrites. But do as they say, because they sit in Moses' seat. Well, that's interesting, because Christ condemned much of what they said, right? They introduced their own traditions from, Talmudic type traditions that were in opposition to the Torah. So why would Christ say, don't do what they do, but do what they say? Why wouldn't he be against everything they did, right? And said. But no, he said, do what they say, not what they do, but do what they say. Why? Because they sit in whose seat? Moses' seat. They sit in Moses' seat. They're in a long line of tradition of the priesthood going back to Moses' seat. Just like the throne of David is the royal bloodline, Christ is implying that Moses' seat is the priestly bloodline that the scribes and Pharisees were now sitting in. So even though I don't want you doing what they do, at least do what they say, because their authority stems back to this original high authority Moses. And yet this original high authority Moses, we don't have any line mentioned in the Bible tracing back to him. Very interesting indeed. So again, this deafening silence about tracing the lineage back to Moses has got to be the biggest cover-up in the entire Bible. This whole matter reeks of a conspiracy, if you will. Why the silence? Why didn't anyone have their lineage in the entire Bible, Old Testament and New, traced back to the most important religious figure in the history of Judaism? We can be sure that Moses, nod, nod, wink, wink, a.k.a. Akhenaten, left something to his sons as well as to Joshua, but we're not told anything about it, at least not in the Bible. Maybe there are other Jewish records that are kept not only from the general public, probably kept from low-level Jews too. But something is strange here, something is afoot. But as far as the Bible goes, it appears that it has censored out this key bit of information. And so we must ask why? Why the censorship? Toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy, as Moses nears the end of his life, he makes it clear to the people of Israel that their nation was to be run by a priestly class, which was not only to handle religious matters, but civil matters as well. And even though the kingly thing came along later, starting with, I think it's in the 1st and 2nd Samuel or whatever, I forget the book that first records it. But anyways, it came later, generations later, right? Centuries later, after the time of Moses, is when the kingly line starts to kick in. They were to be subordinate to the priests. The priests were the overseers of the king, and the king would rule, but only in subjection to the priest, right? And we see this later on in the Dark Ages, don't we? Where the Catholic Church had authority over the kings. The kings still ruled their individual countries, but only as vassals, if you will, under the almighty authority of the Pope. And that's why you get the idea of the divine right of kings. The kings only had a divine right to rule if they were following the number one divine right ruler, the Pope. And you can see that happened, right? No king dared go against the Pope. A few did, but they paid dearly for it. All the Pope had to do is wave his magic wand and say, "You're excommunicated now," and that's it. No king would remain in power for very long. His own people would have overthrown him out of fear of being shut out of heaven, if they're excommunicated collectively. So, yeah, we can see how this whole thing was in place going way back to the time of Moses. Moses established a priesthood, and they were to have the preeminence. In, excuse me, in Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20, Moses makes it clear that if ever the Israelites should feel the need to have a king, he must be chosen and consecrated by the high priest and taken from one of the tribes of Israel, but not from among foreigners. Yet, never does Moses mention who the new spiritual and political head of Israel was to be after his death. The high priest. He never mentions it. While both Aaron and his son Eleazar were priests, neither of them were ever mentioned later on as high priests during, the lifetime, actually even earlier on in the lifetime of Moses. Bible believers often refer to Aaron as high priest, right? It's just assumed because he's always talked about as the priest. But it doesn't actually mention him as high priest. Mention is frequently made of the high priest, and Eleazar, because he is referred to as the priest all the time, he's assumed to have been the high priest. But the Bible doesn't actually say that. It doesn't mention that he actually was the high priest. It's clear that Moses, until the time of his death, was actually supposed to be the high priest. It only makes sense. He was the key figure, not Aaron. Moses was the key figure. And thus, Moses was the political leader as well. At this stage, the high priest and the king, if you will, was one and the same. Moses was both the king. Makes sense, right? If he was actually Akhenaten, he was a king, right? So he viewed himself and ran Israel in such a way that he clearly was the king. He gave the civil law code as well as the 10 Commandments, right? All the book of the law contained all the civil laws. Moses dictated them, supposedly from Yahweh. But Moses was the political leader as well as the religious leader. He's the one who dictated all of the laws pertaining to sacrifice, which Yahweh later reneged on. I talked about that on my YouTube channel recently. If you haven't heard that, go over to Christendom and check that out. Christendom, D-U-M-B. There you'll see how Yahweh commanded sacrifice on every page of the Torah, and yet later on in the Old Testament, and then continuing on into the New Testament, now the whole idea of sacrifice began to be made light of. Yahweh even denied he ever gave the law of sacrifice to the Israelites. It's unbelievable, guys. Go check it out. Yahweh got a facelift. They pulled him away from it because as time went on, they realized that, people were disgusted with all the blood splattering everywhere. And so they need to give Yahweh a new image. And so they pulled away from the whole thing and acted like Yahweh never really demanded sacrifice. That wasn't his idea. Oh, whatever, man. Whatever. But in any case, it's clear that Moses, again, until the time of his death, was actually the high priest, not Aaron. It would only make sense. Moses was the dominant figure. Aaron served a priestly function, but it's clear Moses was actually the high priest. But who took over in this capacity after his death? The Bible deliberately censored out this transmission of power, but sheer logic as well as custom of the day leads us to conclude that Moses must have appointed his firstborn son, Gershom, as his successor, as high priest, and thus as Israel's political leader as well. Later, as I said, there was a branch off, and now Israel did have a king down the line, and they still had this, high priest, the head priest. So now you had the two lines. And if you recall earlier on when I talked about, Christ under the microscope, I talked about how there was supposed to be two Messiah figures, right? In the first century, it wasn't one Messiah that Israel was anticipating. They were looking for two Messiahs. The evidence of that is overwhelming. I present all of that, early on. I'll probably refer back to that or cover that again sometime in another video, talking just specifically about that. But there was a rivalry that went on between Christ and John the Baptist. John the Baptist was supposed to be the spiritual head over Christ, the secular head. Christ was the descendant of David, right? Traced his line to David. So he was to be the head of the royal bloodline, or the king, the kingly Messiah. And John was supposed to be the priestly Messiah. He descended from the priestly line. And he was to have preeminence over Christ. Well, Christ didn't like that. Christ didn't want that. Christ wanted to bring back the old days of Moses, right? Christ was a big fan of Moses. He wanted to be the Moses figure, still of the David line. He wanted to be king, but he also wanted to be priest too. He wanted to be the kingly and the priestly Messiah. But with John the Baptist in the way, that presented a big problem for him, a big barrier. John the Baptist had to be taken out. And as I argued in that series I did, I laid that whole thing out. There's actually evidence of it that still remains. The New Testament was purged of a lot of stuff, but they still left enough evidence in there to show this rivalry. Just like they left enough evidence in there to show that Jesus, like all the other first century messianic claimants, was a frickin' insurrectionist. There's no question. You can prove that right from the pages in the New Testament. And even though the character Jesus, as stated in the Bible, did not exist, it's all a hodgepodge of different characters put together. Primarily, he existed probably in the form of Judas Christus, whose followers were called Christians. That's really the original Christianity. But the character did exist, just not under that exact name, and not all of those stories were actually in the life of Judas Christus. But a good deal of Christ's life story, yes, does match up with the Judas Christus story. So there is some legitimacy to the actual story, just like with the story of Moses. There is some legitimacy. There was a guy who led a band of people out of Egypt. They went to the Sinai en route to Shalem, Jerusalem. But it was Akhenaten. His name was not Moses. But do understand the name Moses is an Egyptian name, like Thutmoses. We'll be covering that in more detail down the line. But you see what happened with Christ? Christ wanted to wed the two lines that had been broken after the time of Moses, the kingly and the priestly. He wanted to unite it back together as one in himself. But later they split again in the Dark Ages, right? You had the church and the state. Well, even before the Dark, in the Middle Ages, early centuries AD, they split again. But Christ wanted them united, and he wanted to be the one to do it. We're told in the New Testament that Christ was indeed both the royal and the priestly Messiah rolled into one. He was called the Son of David, right? And that he is to sit on the throne of David. But we're also told that he's the high priest. We have such a high priest now up in heaven. Paul says in Hebrews, assuming Paul wrote Hebrews, over and over again, Paul refers to Christ as the high priest up in heaven, mediating for us before the great Yahweh. So he was the 2-in-1 Messiah, uniting the two bloodlines, which again later split. I know this is kind of a lot to take in all at once. There's so many details here, but this is absolutely fascinating. And if we're going to be truly wise to the game our enemy has been playing on us down through the centuries, we've got to be aware of these details. It helps fill in a lot of gaps and explain a lot of things that otherwise don't make any sense. Anyway, so we must conclude that Moses left his office to all of his offspring in perpetuity. We're just not told about that passing down of authority to his progeny, right? The Bible was silent on it, which in and of itself tells us how there is this cover-up, right? Nobody ever traced their lineage back to Moses, the single most important person in all of Judaic frickin' history, right? You could argue that Abraham was, because it's supposed to have started from him. No, but Moses is the one who first penned all of this. And again, we just saw where it said, no one greater than him ever has existed, right? He is the key figure. It's from him that the whole line of, the whole priestly line stemmed. Anyway, did Moses, in effect, create a secret society of rulers which would exercise their power covertly down through the ages? Is that why the whole Moses lineage thing is left untouched in the Bible? They don't want you to know that this hidden lineage was being passed on down, that a close watch was being kept on the descendants of Moses, because they were the real sources of power for centuries and centuries on end, even over the kings kings, nod, nod, wink, wink, over ancient Israel. Is this not how elite Jews have operated all through the centuries, though? Through the cover of secret societies such as Freemasonry, which conceal the true rulers behind the scenes? Have they been hiding this Mosaic line? Of course, the ultimate secret behind this secret power structure was/is the creation of a Jew world order, which Moses was the first one to ever mention this thing. For example, in Deuteronomy 28, verse 2, we read, "You shall reign over every nation, but they shall not reign over you. The Lord your God shall set thee on high above all nations of the earth." Moses was the first one to lay the foundation stone of the age-old dream of Jewish world domination. He's the ultimate granddaddy of the New World Order. So doesn't it make sense that nobody would want to trace their line back to him? They don't want anyone knowing the big secret that the whole Jewish world domination scheme, well, they don't want you to know about that secret at all. But they also don't want you to know that it traces back to him, and that they have been carrying on, passing on the torch from generation to generation to Moses' offspring as the ultimate power behind the whole thing. Did you ever see that video of Netanyahu back in the 90s talking with the then current Chabad Lubavitch rabbi? I think it was Schmierson. It looked like a scene out of Star Wars where the evil dark emperor is talking to Vader. Vader, who early on you thought was the kingpin, right? The ultimate bad guy. But no, he answered to someone even more evil than himself. And it was just like that. You know, the rabbi is basically scolding him. Why? Because the rabbi was the real source of power, not Netanyahu, not any of the political leaders. They're just the mouthpieces for the real power source, the rabbis. All through history, it's been the rabbinate that has been the ultimate source of the evil within Judaism. They're the head of the snake, folks. They're the ones calling the shots. They always have. Always. Always. And therefore, we must conclude that they're the ones that trace their line back to Moses, the very originator of the dream of world government. In that video, you've got, and of course, you know, it's all in Hebrew, but they have the translation. You can look it up, guys. It's even on YouTube to this day. It's still there. I'm amazed they haven't deleted that. But there he is. The rabbi is telling Netanyahu, first, Netanyahu says, yes, Rabbi, yes, I'm working very hard, very hard. Well, clearly you're not working hard enough because Mashiach has not come yet. You must do more. The time is running out. The clock is ready to strike midnight, and you have not done what you are supposed to do. Oh, yes, Rabbi. Yes, Rabbi. He's basically on his knees pleading with the guy, right? Yes, Rabbi, I'm sorry. I'm doing the best I can. Clearly you are not. Wow, guys. It's bone-chilling to watch that video. If you have trouble finding it, drop me an email and I'll send you the link to it. But, ooh, it sends a shiver down your spine. But it helps you to see how this whole freaking thing really works. And it helps to buttress what we're talking about here. The rabbis are the real string pullers. After all, they're the ones who wrote the Torah, right? Their descendants, their ancestors wrote it, and now their descendants are carrying on the torch. They're the blood relatives from that line of Moses, right? They see themselves as carrying on this original dream laid down by Moses. You shall reign over every nation, but they shall not reign over you. The Lord your God has set you above all the nations of the earth. This is where the New World Order first began, under Mr. Akhenaten, the Hyksos pharaoh, who the Egyptians threw out. So they went back to Shalem to set up their base of operation there, with the dream of ultimately having that serve as the headquarters of the Jew world order. That's why Israel was established in 1948. And that's why Trump relocated the embassy to Jerusalem in preparation for their grand scheme of setting up their world empire once again. Anyway. Deuteronomy 11:24. Every place whereupon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. From the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even unto the utmost sea shall your coast be. This is what's called Hertz Israel, right? Grand, expanded Israel, not just the current territory of Israel that we see on the map today. Their aim is to encompass the entire Middle East from the river Euphrates to the river Nile. They want that whole territory to be Israel, and that is going to serve as the headquarters, the epicenter, or the capital, if you will, of the world, of their Jew world order. But before they can truly and fully get that into place, they got to kill off a great deal of the population first. And COVID has really tremendously helped with that agenda, and will continue to do so, because we have yet to see the full effects of these vaccines yet. Can you believe the world has no clue that this is going on. And their propaganda has been so effective that when you try to tell them what's happening, you get labeled a whack job when you can clearly prove that this has been the case, that this has been going on all along down through the centuries, that behind the scenes this agenda has been marching forward. Oh, sure, they met up with a lot of setbacks, but they've been relentless in pursuit of this goal, and now they can see it right before them. We're almost there, folks. We're almost there. It's not looking good. We can still stop these monstrosities from succeeding. But every day that goes by, it's looking more and more bleak because they're digging themselves in deeper and deeper and deeper. Their power grows as the masses sink deeper into ignorance and confusion. That's how they pulled it off, guys. Their most powerful weapon of all time has been propaganda. Anyway, what appears to have happened is that the appointment of Gershom as high priest was either completely left out of the book of Deuteronomy, or else it was later removed. Well, we know there was a lot of tampering, right? So that's probably what went on. It was recorded, but later purged because they realized, no, we can't let the world in on this secret that Moses passed on his posterity, and that the Mosaic line was the real power behind the scenes all through the centuries, controlling the banking enterprise and, blah, 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 blah. And that the aim of it all was this dream of world government. They left the dream in there, but somehow it's eluded people. Even Bible dupes who read their Bibles all the time read over things like this, and it goes wee right by them. Because they don't know that there's been this hidden power system behind the scenes orchestrating the whole thing. But I marvel that there are Bible dupes, that there are Christians out there who are aware of the New World Order conspiracy and are against it, and yet they have no clue that the book that they look up to with such reverence, called the Bible, is the birthplace of the New World Order, if you will. It's the original blueprint for world domination, and that they're actually embracing the very book that lays out the whole plan for the system that they're opposed to. And what's even more sad is, for the most part, you can't get them to see that. They will still call the Jews God's chosen people. Even the ones that don't sing the praises of Israel. There are Christians that don't like the state of Israel, recognize it as corrupt, and, when they stage, and I believe this is going to happen, when they stage a fake mass conversion of Jews to Christianity, even the anti-Zionist Christians, so-called, they're really not anti-Zionist, because you can't be anti-Zionist if you embrace the Zionist playbook called the Bible. But in any case, these so-called anti-Zionist Christians are going to, for the most part, jump on board now with Israel and sing its praises. This is a movement of God! Just like in the Middle Ages, many Christians were suckered by the Marranos, right? The fake converts to Catholicism. They got suckered right into that. They opened their arms wide to the, praise the Lord, they have seen the light now. The Jews accepted Jesus. Oh, please. And so just like that worked back then, unfortunately, it's going to work again in the future. And then we're going to see that Jews loved Jesus all along. They didn't hate Jesus. Jesus was the best thing that ever happened to them. They loved the guy. When they say they hate Christians, they're lying. The only time they actually mean that is those few exceptions where Christians actually do believe in those silly standards of morality. They hate that form of Christianity that can't be bought. But the whopping bulk of Christianity, which is putty in their hands, oh, they love Christianity. And they love Christ. They absolutely love Christ. Christ has served them quite well. Like Pope Leo X once said, what a great service this myth of Christ has been for us. And it is a myth, largely. There's elements of truth to the story, and that's what we need to focus on. But yeah, largely the whole story of Christ. Walking on the water, feeding the 5,000, healing the blind and the deaf. Yeah, whatever, man. And turning water into wine by employing the trick of Herod of Alexandria. Yeah. Anyway, it's clear that later editors of the Torah further covered this line of Moses being handed down by inserting into the text the idea that Aaron's son, Eleazar, was appointed high priest, a title which, of course, he had no right to, and probably never actually even held. But is there any evidence that such later editing of the Bible text actually occurred, specifically the editing of the story of Moses' line being handed down? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at in the next video, guys. We already went past the hour mark, so this looks like a good place to stop. All right, guys, I hope you're enjoying this discussion. This is another very important piece of the puzzle. Not too long ago, I did a video on the Merovingian line, right, showing the kingly line, how early in Europe's history this Jewish bloodline had asserted itself as the head of the secular powers in Europe. And then from there, the families all intermarried and they spread out and they carried on the Jewish bloodline, right? But now I'm throwing this in here at this time because it's important to understand how the priestly bloodline was established and how that ran the Vatican later on. So much to take into consideration. You can't do it in 1 or 2 or 3 videos. It just, there's too many details. But, I'm going to do the best I can to put this whole picture together for you. Took me a while. It took me the reading of quite a few books and little scraps and bits and pieces that I would gather here and there. Took me a while to put it all together. But wow, once I saw it, that's it. There's no denying it, how this whole thing has played out, how we got into this freaking mess that we find ourselves stuck in now. All right, guys, thanks for joining me. We'll catch you in the next video. Take care.